right. Take 6 or 7, I don't know. I'm foggiest the day after I drink, not the evening that I am actually drunk. And this is the most difficult position for me to defend. It was stupid of me. But let's begin with something, with a few considerations. When you're arguing for the New Age, I think it's the least orthodox worldview. It's the least standardized. But of all the different variations New Age has to offer, I think arguing for a transcendental reality would be prudent. I think arguing in defense of mysticism would be prudent. And then arguing against all the science geeks out there that say, look, and they point to someone like James Randi and say, psychics don't exist because James Randi and other scientists like him haven't found them yet. Fantastic. And I want to start with that one because that's the one that's freshest in my mind. There's a very large misconception in the world, and you might be one of these people that have this misconception about the nature of evidence. Specifically and only empirical evidence. What is empirical evidence? You ought to know if you want to be a science geek. Most science geeks don't know what empirical evidence is, though. Empirical evidence is the documentation of actual observation, which is to say, if I observe a fish in a river, and that river travels upstream, if the fish travels upstream to spawn, we might say that all fish of that type, say I call it salmon, and we could say all fish of this kind, of this species, will have this kind of behavior. Well, what basis do you have for that? Empirical evidence. That's my basis. The empirical evidence of actually observing this in the past. This is what happened in the past. I think it'll happen in the future. That's empirical evidence. It is not empirical evidence or to consider what is not observed and then to point to the non-existence of something. This is the question of whether or not the absence of evidence can be considered evidence of absence. It cannot be considered as empirical evidence of absence. There is no such thing as empirical evidence of absence of anything, because empirical evidence is only going to be that which is observed. So unless you're observing a void and can somehow tell us about it, then great. Otherwise, empirical evidence is only going to be a documentation that was actually observed. And so, can you collect empirical data against the existence of something? No, you can't. Categorically, you can't. Evidence in a looser sense, the idea that, okay, we have evidence, we have, say, a lot of psychic claims in the world. None of them have been tested successfully in the most rigorous scientific environments, and because of this, we believe that none of it is true. This inductive reasoning, and it is inductive reasoning, is not based on empirical evidence. It ain't based on empirical evidence. It's based on the lack of empirical evidence. Do you see the difference? But then we're dealing with the problem of induction. Inductive reasoning it has its problems. The only way that science can do it and get away with it is because its inductive reasoning is supported by empirical evidence. It all makes perfect sense. And so all you guys that haven't read, say, read Kemeny. If you don't know who Kemeny is, don't tell me you know anything about the philosophy of science. And he's just one guy. You could read Bacon, you could read and I've forgotten all their names, but Kemeny for certain, because he's talking about the world of fact. He has this great diagram: world of fact, world of scientific knowledge. I guess I forget exactly what the second term was. A couple years. They make an observation. You induce a hypothesis, such as you watch a fish swim up the stream, call it a salmon. Say that all fish that can be considered salmon swim upstream. Not this particular fish. It doesn't have just a bone in its head, or it's not trying to avoid pollution downstream or something crazy like that. This is just what you do when you're a salmon. That's an inductive reasoning. But it's inductive reasoning on the basis of empirical data. It's very important, because inductive reasoning without the basis of empirical data is just not as good as it could be. So to claim that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence may be true, that it is evidence of absence, but it ain't very good evidence of absence. Just like we could say a greeting card that pictures Santa Claus is evidence of the existence of Santa Claus. It's just not very good evidence, because it's not empirical evidence in any sense. And people like to think of all evidence as empirical evidence when it's not. Empirical evidence is only when you see the thing. So from that, when we look at someone like James Randi, can we conclude that certainly there does not exist physical phenomenon or psychic phenomenon? And certainly we cannot. And James Randi rightly acknowledges this on a regular basis. He doesn't believe personally, and again, he's a very robust thinker, because he's very specific about his speech. He says personally he doesn't believe that he's going to find any in his lifetime, or that perhaps ever at all. Okay, but that claim is not based on empirical evidence, though it may be based on non-empirical evidence, such as the lack of empirical evidence that is going to be supporting his claim. Do you see the difference? His evidence is the lack of empirical evidence, but that is not as robust as empirical evidence itself. Just as I could say, look, I'm going to set out right now and search for Saturn. I'm going to go by foot, and by the time I am on my deathbed and I haven't found it, is that evidence, empirical evidence against the existence of Saturn? No, it is the lack of empirical evidence that I may use personally as evidence that Saturn doesn't exist. Fantastic. Now that's very important, because that consideration comes into play again when we consider things like Occam's razor. When we're arguing for the existence of a transcendental reality, these sorts of things, it may present itself as a non-conservative hypothesis of the world, something that Occam's razor would have a heyday with. Something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, comes to mind. But with this correct understanding of what actually empirical evidence is, rather than evidence or something posing itself as evidence when it's really just the lack of empirical evidence, we have a much more defined notion of what actually a conservative hypothesis is. Is it a conservative hypothesis to assume that Saturn doesn't exist because there is a lack of empirical evidence? No. The conservative position in that case is to say, I don't know. It is a conservative hypothesis to say that all salmon swim upstream after just observing a finite set amount, a small group comparative to the whole population. But in the case of the absence of empirical evidence, the only conservative hypothesis is to say, I don't know, not that it cannot exist or does not exist or anything of that nature. So next video, we need to talk about how we might claim knowledge of the transcendental universe without the aid of science.